The old pickup truck coughed and wheezed as Maya drove down the dusty road leading to her grandfather's ranch. She had made this drive countless times as a child, but now everything felt different. The familiar hills and endless fields of Montana stretched out before her, but instead of bringing comfort, they filled her with worry. 3 months ago, her life had been completely different. She was working at a small accounting firm in Denver, living in a tiny apartment, and her biggest concern was whether she could afford to grab coffee on her way to work. Then the phone call came. Grandpa Joe had passed away suddenly from a heart attack while checking on his cattle one morning. Maya pulled up to the old farmhouse and turned off the engine. The silence hit her immediately. No sounds of cattle lowing, no distant hum of farm equipment, no cheerful whistle from Grandpa Joe as he worked in the barn. Just endless, empty quiet. She walked up the wooden steps to the front porch, her footsteps echoing louder than they should. The house key felt heavy in her hand as she unlocked the door. Inside, everything was exactly as Grandpa Joe had left it. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen table, half empty and now covered with a thin film. His reading glasses lay folded next to yesterday's newspaper. The lawyer had explained everything to her a week after the funeral. Grandpa Joe had left her the entire ranch, all 2,000 acres of it, plus the house, the barn, and the 200 head of cattle that roamed the property. At first, Maya had been touched by his generosity. Then reality set in. She knew nothing about running a ranch. Her first week had been a disaster. She'd tried to milk the cows and ended up getting kicked. She'd attempted to fix a broken fence post and somehow made it worse. The cattle seemed to sense her inexperience and barely listened to her attempts at hurting them. By the end of that week, she was covered in mud, exhausted, and questioning every decision that had led her to this point. But she couldn't just give up. This ranch had been in her family for 3 generations. Grandpa Joe had built it from nothing, working sunrise to sunset for 50 years to make it profitable. The thought of selling it to some big corporation made her stomach turn. She had to at least try. The learning curve was steep and painful. Maya spent hours watching YouTube videos about cattle care, fence repair, and basic farm equipment maintenance. She drove to the feed store in town every few days, asking endless questions that probably made the staff think she was completely hopeless. Some days she felt like she was making progress. Other days she wanted to cry from frustration. The loneliness was almost as difficult as the physical work. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and Maya hadn't met them yet. Her cell phone barely got signal on most of the property. When something went wrong, and something went wrong almost daily, she had no one to call for help. One particularly bad morning, Maya discovered that several of her cattle had somehow gotten through a fence and wandered onto the main road. She spent 3 hours trying to herd them back, running around like a crazy person while cars honked and drivers shouted at her. A kind trucker finally stopped to help, but Maya felt embarrassed and overwhelmed. This was not sustainable. The financial pressure was mounting too. The ranch generated some income from selling cattle, but Maya didn't understand the timing or the market prices. She was spending money on repairs faster than she was making it back. The feed costs alone were eating up her savings. Winter was coming, and she knew she needed to prepare the animals and the property, but she had no idea how. Every morning, Maya would stand on her front porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the vast expanse of land that was now her responsibility. The mountains in the distance were beautiful, but they also reminded her how isolated she was. Sometimes she would go an entire day without speaking to another human being. The cattle had their own personalities. She was learning there was a big black bull who seemed to be the leader of the herd, a brown and white cow who was always getting into trouble, a group of younger calves who followed their mothers everywhere. Maya found herself talking to them sometimes, just to hear the sound of a voice. Even if it was her own. At night, the silence was even more intense. City sounds like traffic and sirens had been replaced by wind through the trees and the occasional coyote howl in the distance. Maya would lie in bed, listening to the old house settle and creak. Feeling very small and very alone, she tried calling her parents for advice, but they lived in Florida and knew even less about ranching than she did. Her few friends from Denver were sympathetic, but couldn't offer practical help. Maya was truly on her own, learning through trial and error, making mistakes that cost time and money she couldn't afford to lose. The worst part was feeling like she was letting Grandpa Joe down. He had spent his whole life building this ranch, turning it into something successful and profitable. Now his granddaughter was struggling to keep it running for even a few months. Maya would sometimes find herself apologizing out loud to his memory when things went particularly wrong. As autumn progressed and the weather started to turn colder, Maya's anxiety grew. She knew that winter on a ranch would bring new challenges she wasn't prepared for. The cattle would need different care. The equipment would need winterizing. Snow and ice would make every task more difficult and dangerous. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, Maya made a decision. She couldn't do this alone anymore. She needed help, and she needed it soon. Tomorrow, she would drive into town and start asking around for someone who could teach her how to run this ranch properly. She had no idea that help was already on its way, in a form she never could have expected. 2 young men were already planning their visit to her isolated ranch, and their offer of assistance would change everything. Maya went to bed that night feeling determined but still very much alone, unaware that her solitary days were numbered. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the cattle shifted restlessly in the pasture. Maya pulled her blanket tighter and tried to imagine what Grandpa Joe would do in her situation. She fell asleep hoping that somehow, somewhere there, was someone who could help her save the ranch that meant everything to her family. Maya woke up to the sound of knocking on her front door. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Nobody ever came to the ranch unannounced. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the mailman usually just left packages by the gate at the end of the long driveway. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand. 7:30 in the morning. Maya groaned and rolled out of bed, grabbing a robe to throw over her pajamas. Her hair was a mess, and she probably looked terrible, but whoever was knocking seemed persistent. The sound came again, polite but steady, when Maya opened the front door. She was surprised to see 2 young men standing on her porch. They looked like they could be brothers, maybe even twins. Both had dark hair, clean-shaven faces, and were dressed nicely in button-down shirts and dark jeans. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. "Good morning, miss," said the one on the left, giving her a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you so early. Are you Maya Chin, the owner of this ranch?" Maya nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The second young man stepped forward. "My name is David, and this is my brother Daniel. We heard in town that you might be having some difficulties running this place on your own. We're really sorry for your loss," Daniel added quickly. "Everyone spoke very highly of your grandfather. He was well respected in the community." Maya felt a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. News traveled fast in small towns, apparently. "Thank you, and yes, I'm still learning how to manage everything." Here, David and Daniel exchanged a look that Maya couldn't quite read. Then David spoke again. "We know this might sound strange, but we wanted to come out and see if you might be interested in some help. Our father has been working with cattle and managing ranches for over 20 years. He's between jobs right now and looking for a new opportunity. We heard you inherited this place recently," Daniel continued, "and we know how overwhelming it can be to take over a ranch operation, especially if you don't have experience with livestock and land management." Maya studied the 2 young men more carefully. There was something oddly formal about the way they spoke, like they were giving a rehearsed presentation. But their offer was exactly what she had been hoping to find. "Your father has ranch experience?" "Extensive experience," David confirmed. "He's managed properties twice the size of this one. Cattle breeding, pasture rotation, equipment maintenance, financial planning for agricultural operations. He understands every aspect of ranch management." Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "He could assess your current situation and help you develop a comprehensive plan for making this ranch profitable again. We know it has great potential. Maya felt a flutter of hope in her chest. This seemed too good to be true. Where has your father worked previously? Several large operations across Montana and Wyoming, David replied smoothly. Most recently, he was managing a 5,000-acre cattle ranch about 200 miles north of here. The owners decided to sell to a development company, so he's been looking for a new position. We've been traveling around the state, visiting different ranches and farms, Daniel added. When we heard about your situation, our father was very interested. He likes helping people who are committed to keeping family ranches in operation. Maya wrapped her robe tighter around herself. The morning air was cold, and she was starting to shiver. This is very kind of you to offer, but I should mention that I'm not in a position to pay much right now. The ranch is barely breaking even. That's not a problem, David said quickly. Our father isn't looking for a big salary. He enjoys the work itself. He would be happy to help in exchange for room and board while he gets the operation back on track. Once the ranch is profitable again, you could discuss fair compensation, Daniel suggested. But initially, he just wants the opportunity to do what he loves and help someone preserve their family legacy. Maya couldn't believe what she was hearing. These young men were offering exactly the solution she needed, and they seemed genuine in their desire to help. Still, something felt unusual about the whole situation. How did you know I was having difficulties? I haven't really talked to anyone in town about my problems. Small communities talk, David replied with a shrug. People at the feed store, the diner, the gas station. Everyone knows everyone else's business around here. They mentioned that Joe Chun's granddaughter had inherited the ranch and was trying to manage it alone. People are concerned about you, Daniel added. They remember your grandfather fondly and want to see his ranch continue to succeed. The explanation made sense, but Maya still felt slightly uneasy. There was something about the way the brothers looked at each other, quick glances that seemed to communicate more than their words. When would your father be available to come look at the property? He could be here as early as tomorrow, David said. He's very eager to meet you and assess the ranch's needs. We brought some references with us, Daniel added, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. Previous employers who can speak to his qualifications and character. Maya took the paper and glanced at it. There were 3 names and phone numbers listed, along with brief descriptions of ranch operations. Everything looked professional and legitimate. I appreciate this, but I feel like I should call these references before making any decisions. Of course, David said. That's very wise. Take all the time you need to check his background. We understand that inviting someone to live and work on your property is a big decision, Daniel added, especially for a woman living alone. Oh. Father completely respects that, and he wants you to feel comfortable with the arrangement. Maya looked back and forth between the 2 brothers. They seemed sincere and respectful. Their offer was exactly what she had been praying for, but something in her gut told her to be cautious. How did you find my ranch? I don't have any signs posted, and the driveway isn't marked. We asked for directions in town, David replied without hesitation. The woman at the post office gave us very detailed instructions on how to get here. She seemed to know you quite well, Daniel added, with a smile. Said you've been coming in regularly to ask questions about ranch management. Maya blushed, remembering her frequent trips to town for advice and supplies. Of course, people had noticed her struggles. Well, I certainly need all the help I can get, she admitted. Our father specializes in exactly these situations, David assured her. He's helped several families transition into ranch management after inheriting property. He understands the challenges you're facing. Would you like used to have him call you later today? Daniel suggested. That way you can speak with him directly and get a better sense of whether this arrangement might work. Maya nodded slowly. That would be good. I do have a lot of questions about what needs to be done before winter. Perfect, David said, smiling broadly. He'll be so pleased to hear that you're interested. He's really passionate about helping family ranches stay in operation. The brothers thanked Maya for her time and walked back to their truck, which she now noticed was parked at the end of her driveway. As they drove away, Maya watched from her porch, still holding the paper with the references. Everything about? Their visit had seemed positive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off about the whole encounter. She went back inside and made coffee, thinking about the conversation. By the time she finished her first cup, Maya had convinced herself that she was being paranoid. These young men had offered exactly the help she needed, at exactly the right time. Maybe this was just good luck finally coming her way. Maya spent the entire afternoon calling the references that David and Daniel had given her. Each conversation went better than she had hoped. The ranch owners spoke highly of Robert Coleman, describing him as knowledgeable, hardworking, and honest. One woman even said that Robert had saved her family's ranch from bankruptcy. "He turned our whole operation around in less than 6 months," she told Maya over the phone. "We went from losing money every month to actually making a profit. Robert knows cattle better than anyone I've ever met." By evening, Maya felt confident about her decision. When Robert called that night, his voice was warm and reassuring. He asked thoughtful questions about her current challenges and offered practical suggestions that made immediate sense. They agreed that he would come to the ranch the next morning to look around and discuss the details. Maya barely slept that night. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, she felt hopeful about the future. Maybe she wouldn't have to sell the property after all. Maybe she could actually make Grandpa Joe's dream continue. The next morning, Maya was dressed and ready. By 7 o'clock, she had cleaned the guest quarters in the barn and prepared a simple breakfast. When she heard a truck coming up the driveway, her heart started beating faster with nervous excitement. Robert Coleman stepped out of the driver's seat, and Maya was immediately struck by his presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and intense blue eyes. He moved with the confident stride of someone who had spent his whole life working outdoors. David and Daniel climbed out of the passenger side, both smiling and waving at Maya. "You must be Maya," Robert said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Thank you for considering my offer to help. I know it takes courage to trust strangers with something as important as your family's ranch." His voice was deep and steady, and when he looked at her, Maya felt like he was really seeing her, understanding the weight of responsibility she was carrying. "I'm grateful you're willing to help," she replied. "I honestly don't know what I'm doing most of the time," Robert chuckled. "That's completely normal. Ranch management is complicated, and it takes years to learn all the tricks. But you have good instincts, and that's the most important thing." They walked toward the pasture, where Maya's cattle were grazing. Robert immediately began pointing out things that Maya had never noticed. "You've got some excellent breeding stock here," he said, studying the animals with an expert eye. "That bull over there has outstanding conformation. Your grandfather knew how to select quality cattle." As they continued the tour, Robert identified problems and solutions with impressive speed. He noticed that the water system needed upgrading, that several fence posts were rotting and needed replacement, and that the pasture rotation could be improved to better manage the grass growth. "The bones of this operation are very solid," Robert explained as they walked. "Your grandfather built something really good here. It just needs some fine-tuning and better organization." Maya found herself hanging on his every word. Everything Robert said made perfect sense, and his confidence was infectious. "How long do you think it would take to get things running smoothly?" she asked. "With the right approach, we could have this place profitable within 6 months," Robert replied without hesitation. "The key is implementing systems that work efficiently and focusing on the areas that will generate the most immediate return on investment." They spent 2 hours walking around the property. Robert examined the barn, the equipment, the feed storage areas, and every aspect of the ranch operation. He took notes in a small notebook and asked Maya detailed questions about her current expenses and income. "I can see why you've been struggling," Robert said finally. "You're working much harder than you need to, and you're not maximizing the potential of what you have here. I feel like I'm just barely keeping my head above water, Maya admitted. That's going to change, Robert assured her. But I want to be completely honest with you about what this arrangement would involve. I work long days and I expect the same dedication from everyone around me. This isn't going to be easy. Maya nodded eagerly. I'm willing to work as hard as necessary. This ranch means everything to me. Good, Robert said with approval. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. They returned to the house to discuss the practical details. Robert explained that he would handle all the major decisions about cattle management, pasture rotation, equipment purchases, and financial planning. Maya would continue to own the ranch, but she would need to trust his judgment about day-to-day operations. I know this requires a lot of faith, Robert said. You're essentially putting your entire livelihood in my hands, but I promise you that I will treat this ranch as if it were my own property. David and Daniel had been quietly helpful throughout the morning, carrying tools and taking notes for their father. They seemed to anticipate his needs without being asked, and Maya was impressed by their respectful attitude and strong work ethic. My sons will be staying here with me, Robert explained. They're both experienced with ranch work, and they'll be able to help with the daily tasks that keep everything running smoothly. That sounds perfect, Maya said. The guest quarters in the barn should be comfortable for the three of you. We're not picky about accommodations, Robert replied with a smile. We're used to simple living. As long as we have a roof over our heads and a place to cook meals, we'll be fine. Maya felt a surge of relief and gratitude. I can't tell you how much this means to me. I was starting to think I might have to sell the ranch. That would be a real tragedy, Robert said seriously. Properties like this are becoming rare. Once they're sold to developers or big corporations, they're lost forever. Family ranches are an important part of what makes rural communities strong. They agreed that Robert and his sons would move in the following week. Robert wanted a few days to organize his affairs and gather some specialized equipment that he thought would be useful for improving the ranch's efficiency. I'll bring my own tools and some diagnostic equipment for testing soil and water quality, he explained. I also have contacts with feed suppliers and livestock buyers who can help us get better prices for both our inputs and our outputs. As the three men prepared to leave, Robert shook Maya's hand again. You've made a wise decision, he told her. In 6 months, you're going to be amazed at what this place can become. Maya watched their truck disappear down the driveway, feeling more optimistic than she had since inheriting the ranch. For the first time, she could actually envision a future where the property was successful and profitable. That evening, she called her parents to tell them about the arrangement. They were pleased that she had found experienced help, but advised her to be cautious about giving too much control to people she had just met. Trust your instincts, her mother said, and remember that it's still your ranch. Don't let anyone pressure you into decisions that don't feel right. Maya appreciated their concern, but she felt confident about her choice. Robert Coleman seemed like exactly the kind of experienced, knowledgeable partner she needed. His references had been excellent, his sons were polite and hardworking, and his assessment of the ranch's potential was encouraging. As she prepared for bed that night, Maya looked out her bedroom window at the pasture where her cattle were settling down for the night. Soon, those animals would be part of a properly managed, profitable operation. The ranch that had been her grandfather's pride and joy would thrive again. She had no way of knowing that Robert Coleman wasn't who he claimed to be, or that his sons had been carefully trained to help him execute a plan that had nothing to do with saving family ranches. Maya fell asleep that night feeling hopeful and secure, completely unaware that she had just invited dangerous strangers into her home. Robert and his sons moved onto the ranch on a bright Monday morning in late October. Maya watched from her kitchen window as they unloaded their belongings from 2 pickup trucks. They didn't seem to have much, just a few suitcases, some tools, and several boxes that Robert carried carefully into the barn. Within hours, the entire atmosphere of the ranch had changed. Robert immediately took charge, walking the property with a clipboard and making detailed notes. David and Daniel worked alongside him with impressive efficiency, as if they had done this routine many times before. First priority is fixing that water system, Robert announced after completing his inspection. The cattle aren't getting enough fresh water, and that's affecting their health and growth rates. Maya had been struggling with the water pumps for weeks, never quite understanding why they kept malfunctioning. Within 2 days, Robert had completely overhauled the system. He installed new pipes, repaired the main pump, and set up an automatic timer that ensured the water troughs were always full. How did you figure that out so quickly? Maya asked, amazed at the transformation. Experience, Robert replied with a confident smile. I've seen this exact problem on dozens of ranches. Once you know what to look for, the solution becomes obvious. The improvements continued at a pace that left Maya feeling both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. Robert reorganized the entire feed storage system, implementing a rotation schedule that prevented waste and saved money. He identified which cattle were ready for market and arranged sales that brought in more money than Maya had seen in months. David and Daniel proved to be incredibly capable workers. They seemed to understand ranch operations instinctively, handling tasks that Maya had struggled with for weeks. David had a particular talent for working with the cattle, moving them between pastures with ease. Daniel was excellent with equipment repair, fixing machinery that Maya had assumed was beyond salvation. Your sons are remarkably skilled for their age, Maya commented to Robert one evening as they watched the boys efficiently repair a broken fence. I've been training them since they were young, Robert explained. Ranch work is in their blood. They understand that every detail matters when you're trying to run a successful operation. Within 2 weeks, the ranch was operating more smoothly than it had since Grandpa Joe's death. The cattle looked healthier, the pastures were better managed, and Maya's stress levels had dropped dramatically. She found herself relying on Robert's expertise for everything from minor equipment issues to major financial decisions. I want to invest in some new breeding stock, Robert suggested during one of their evening planning sessions. Your current herd has good genetics, but we could improve the quality significantly with the right additions. Maya hesitated. That sounds expensive. I'm not sure I have the budget for major purchases right now. Think of it as an investment, Robert explained patiently. Better breeding stock means higher quality calves, which sell for premium prices. The initial cost will pay for itself within 2 breeding cycles. His logic was compelling, and Maya found it difficult to argue with his extensive knowledge. How much are we talking about? I have connections with some excellent breeders, Robert replied. I could probably arrange purchases for about $30,000 spread over several months. The return on investment would be substantial. The amount made Maya nervous, but Robert's confidence was reassuring. He had already improved the ranch's profitability significantly. If he believed this investment would pay off, she was inclined to trust his judgment. Let me think about it, Maya said finally. Of course, Robert agreed. But I should mention that the breeding season is approaching. If we're going to make these improvements, we need to act soon. As the weeks passed, Maya noticed some unusual patterns in the Coleman family's behavior. They seemed to sleep very little, often working late into the night on projects around the ranch. Sometimes Maya would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and see lights on in the barn or hear the sound of vehicles moving around the property. Do you guys ever rest? She asked David one morning after seeing him working in the pasture before sunrise. We're used to early hours, David replied smoothly. Dad taught us that successful ranch operations require dedication around the clock. Maya also noticed that the family seemed to avoid certain areas of the ranch. They never went near the old storage shed behind the house, and they always found reasons to keep Maya away from the far corner of the property where Grandpa Joe used to keep his vintage tractor collection. Is there something wrong with that area? Maya asked when Robert steered her away from the shed for the 3rd time in a week. Just some safety concerns, Robert explained. The ground is unstable there, and I don't want anyone getting hurt until we can address the drainage issues. These odd behaviors were puzzling, but Maya was so grateful for the improvements to her ranch that she didn't press for explanations. The cattle were healthier, The equipment was running smoothly, and for the first time since inheriting the property, she felt like she might actually be able to make it work. Robert's knowledge seemed unlimited. He could diagnose problems with machinery just by listening to the engine sounds. He knew exactly when to rotate the cattle between pastures for optimal grass growth. He understood market trends and timing for livestock sales better than anyone Maya had ever met. "You're like a ranch management encyclopedia," Maya told him one afternoon as he explained the intricacies of pasture soil chemistry. "I've been doing this for a long time," Robert replied. "When you love the work, you never stop learning." Maya found herself becoming increasingly dependent on Robert's expertise. She stopped making any decisions about the ranch without consulting him first. When equipment suppliers called, she directed them to speak with Robert. When neighbors stopped by to chat about local agricultural issues, she deferred to his knowledge. "You don't need to ask my permission for everything," Robert told her gently when she sought his approval for a minor feed purchase. "This is your ranch. I'm just here to help." But Maya had lost confidence in her own judgment. Robert's decisions had been so consistently successful that she worried about making mistakes if she acted independently. "I just don't want to mess up what you've accomplished here," she admitted. "You won't," Robert assured her. "But part of my job is teaching you to manage this place yourself. You can't depend on me forever." Despite his words, Maya noticed that Robert seemed to discourage her independence in subtle ways. When she suggested trying a different approach to a problem, he would explain why his method was better. When she wanted to research alternative solutions, he would provide so much detailed information that she felt overwhelmed and gave up. The ranch was undeniably more successful than it had been in months, but Maya was beginning to realize that she understood less about its operations than when she had been struggling alone. Robert and his sons had taken over so completely that she sometimes felt like a guest on her own property. Still, the results were impressive. The ranch was generating steady income, the cattle were thriving, and Maya's financial stress was significantly reduced. Whatever concerns she had about the Coleman family's unusual habits seemed minor compared to the dramatic improvements they had brought to her operation. One evening, as Maya watched Robert and his sons work efficiently in the barn, she reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been desperate and alone, convinced that she would have to sell the ranch. Now she had experienced partners who had transformed the property into a successful operation. She had no idea that Robert's late-night activities had nothing to do with ranch management, or that the boxes he had brought contained equipment for an entirely different kind of operation. Maya went to bed that night feeling grateful and secure, completely unaware that her growing dependence on the Coleman family was exactly what they had been working to achieve. Maya's first hint that something might be wrong came when she was looking for her grandfather's old ranch records. She needed the vaccination history for some of the older cattle, and Grandpa Joe had always kept meticulous files in his office desk. As she searched through the drawers, Maya realized that several important documents were missing. The original deed to the property, her grandfather's will, and the insurance papers for the ranch equipment had all disappeared. At first, she assumed she had simply misplaced them during the chaos of the past few months. "Have you seen any paperwork lying around?" she asked Robert that evening. "Some important documents seem to have gone missing from my grandfather's desk." "What kind of documents?" Robert asked, his expression remaining neutral. "Legal papers, insurance information, that sort of thing. I'm sure they'll turn up somewhere." "Property documents can be easily replaced if necessary," Robert replied smoothly. "The county courthouse keeps copies of everything important." Maya nodded, but something about his quick dismissal bothered her. Grandpa Joe had been extremely organized, and those papers had been in his desk for years. They wouldn't just disappear on their own. A few days later, Maya decided to do some research on ranch management techniques. She wanted to better understand the improvements Robert had made so she could learn from his expertise. When she tried to look up some of the methods he had described, she couldn't find any information that matched his explanations. Curious, Maya began searching for more specific details about Robert's background. She decided to call one of his references again, hoping to learn more about his previous work experience. When she dialed the number for the ranch owner who had spoken so highly of Robert's skills, she got a strange response. "I'm sorry, but we've never employed anyone by that name," the woman told her. "Are you sure you have the right number?" Maya double-checked the contact information. The phone number was correct, but the woman insisted that no one named Robert Coleman had ever worked at their ranch. Confused and slightly alarmed, Maya called the other two references on the list. The second number had been disconnected. The third number connected her to a man who claimed to run a cattle operation, but when Maya described Robert and his sons, he said he had never heard of them. There must be some mistake, Maya told herself, but a cold feeling was growing in her stomach. She decided to do some internet research on Robert Coleman and ranch management in Montana. After hours of searching, Maya found no record of Robert Coleman working at any of the ranches he had claimed to manage. There were no articles about his expertise, no professional profiles, no mentions of his name in any agricultural publications. It was as if he had never existed in the ranching community. That evening, Maya decided to look more carefully around the ranch for anything unusual. She waited until Robert and his sons had gone to bed, then quietly walked around the property with a flashlight. Behind the barn, in an area she rarely visited, Maya discovered several pieces of equipment that she didn't recognize. There were electronic devices, cables, and what looked like surveillance gear hidden under a tarp. None of it had anything to do with cattle ranching. Maya's heart began beating faster as she examined the strange equipment. One device looked like a sophisticated radio system. Another appeared to be some kind of recording equipment. There were also several cell phones and what looked like fake identification cards scattered among the cables. As she moved closer to get a better look, Maya accidentally knocked over a small box. The contents spilled onto the ground, and she found herself staring at a collection of credit cards, driver's licenses, and social security cards, all with different names and addresses. Her hands trembling, Maya picked up one of the driver's licenses. It showed Robert's photo, but the name on the card was Thomas Mitchell. Another card had the same photo with the name James Patterson. There were at least 6 different identities, all with Robert's picture. Maya quickly gathered up the scattered items and put them back in the box, her mind racing. These weren't ranch management tools. This was equipment for some kind of illegal operation. Robert Coleman wasn't even his real name. She hurried back to the house, trying to stay calm and think clearly. Everything about the Coleman family suddenly made sense in a terrifying new way. Their strange sleeping patterns, their avoidance of certain areas, their reluctance to let her make independent decisions. They weren't trying to help her save the ranch. They were running some kind of scam. Maya spent the rest of the night researching property fraud and ranch cons on the internet. What she found made her blood run cold. There were articles about criminals who targeted isolated property owners, especially inheritance situations where the new owner lacked experience. The pattern was always similar. The criminals would offer help and expertise, gradually taking control of the property's operations. They would isolate the owner from outside contacts and make them dependent on the criminal's management. Eventually, they would manipulate the owner into signing over power of attorney or transferring ownership of the property. Maya realized with growing horror that this was exactly what had been happening to her. Robert had taken control of every aspect of the ranch's operations. She had been making fewer and fewer independent decisions. She had even considered giving him authority to make major financial investments on her behalf. As dawn approached, Maya tried to figure out what to do next. She couldn't confront Robert directly. She was outnumbered and isolated on the ranch. She needed help, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. For all she knew, Robert had connections in the local community who might be working with him. Maya decided to drive to town that morning and try to gather more information. She told Robert that she needed to run errands and would be gone for most of the day. He seemed unconcerned, which probably meant he wasn't worried about her discovering anything. At the county courthouse, Maya requested copies of her property records. She was relieved to find that the ranch was still legally registered in her name, but she noticed that someone had been making inquiries about the property's tax status and ownership history. "Has anyone else been asking about this property recently?" Maya asked the clerk. "A man came in about 2 weeks ago," the clerk replied. "Said he was helping the new owner understand the tax obligations. Seemed to know a lot about the property's history." Maya's stomach sank. Robert had been researching her legal ownership, probably looking for ways to challenge or transfer it. She was running out of time to stop whatever he was planning. That afternoon, Maya visited the local police station. She explained her situation to the desk officer, trying to sound calm and rational despite her growing panic. "Do you have any proof that these men are planning to commit a crime?" the officer asked. Maya realized that she didn't have solid evidence of criminal intent. The fake identification cards and strange equipment were suspicious, but not necessarily illegal. Robert's false references were concerning, but he hadn't actually stolen anything yet. "We can't arrest someone for having multiple ID cards or giving false job references," the officer explained. "Unless they actually commit a crime, there's not much we can do." Maya left the police station feeling more alone and frightened than ever. She was convinced that Robert and his sons were planning to steal her ranch, but she couldn't prove it, and law enforcement couldn't help her without evidence of an actual crime. As she drove back to the ranch that evening, Maya tried to develop a plan. She needed to gather concrete evidence of their criminal intentions. She also needed to find a way to protect herself and her property without alerting Robert to her suspicions. When she arrived home, Robert was waiting for her on the front porch. "How were your errands?" he asked with his usual friendly smile. "Fine," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just took care of some paperwork in town." "Good," Robert said. "We need to discuss those cattle purchases we talked about. I've found some excellent breeding stock that's available immediately, but we need to move quickly if we want to secure the deal." Maya nodded and smiled, playing along while her mind raced with fear and determination. She was trapped on her own ranch with dangerous criminals, but she wasn't going to let them steal everything her grandfather had worked to build. She had no idea how much time she had before Robert made his final move, but Maya was determined to stop him before it was too late. That night, she lay in bed planning her next steps, knowing that her life and her grandfather's legacy depended on her ability to outsmart the people she had trusted to save her ranch. Maya knew she needed concrete evidence before she could take action against Robert and his sons. Over the next few days, she began carefully observing their activities and searching for proof of their criminal intentions. Her opportunity came when Robert announced that he needed to drive to a livestock auction 3 hours away. "David and Daniel will stay here to handle the daily ranch work," he told Maya. "I should be back by evening." Maya waited until she saw Robert's truck disappear down the road, then told the boys that she was going to spend the day organizing her grandfather's old files in the house. This would give her an excuse to stay away from them while she investigated. Once she was sure David and Daniel were busy in the far pasture, Maya snuck back to the barn where the Coleman family was staying. She had noticed that Robert kept a locked briefcase under his bed, and she was determined to find out what was inside. The lock was simple, and Maya managed to open it using a paperclip after several tense minutes. What she found inside made her hands shake with anger and fear. The briefcase contained detailed files on 3 other ranches, complete with property records, ownership histories, and personal information about the owners. There were photographs of ranch buildings, maps of property boundaries, and financial records that could only have been obtained illegally. One file was labeled Johnson Ranch and contained newspaper clippings about an elderly rancher who had died in an accident after signing over his property to someone named Thomas Mitchell. Maya recognized the name from one of Robert's fake driver's licenses. Another file documented the Miller Ranch, where a widow had supposedly committed suicide after losing her property in a business deal gone wrong. The file contained forged documents and what appeared to be a detailed plan for manipulating the grieving woman into signing away her inheritance. The third file was about the Peterson Ranch, which had been sold to a development company after the owner suffered a mysterious accident that left him unable to manage his affairs. Again, Thomas Mitchell was listed as the person who had handled the property transaction. At the bottom of the briefcase, Maya found a folder with her own name on it. Inside were copies of her grandfather's will, property deeds, and detailed financial records that Robert had somehow obtained. There were also photographs of Maya taken without her knowledge, showing her doing ranch work and visiting town. Most disturbing of all was a handwritten timeline titled Chun Ranch Acquisition Plan. The document outlined a step-by-step strategy for taking control of Maya's property. The plan involved gradually isolating her from outside contacts, making her dependent on Robert's expertise, and eventually convincing her to sign a power of attorney agreement. The final step in the plan was chilling, subject elimination after property transfer completion. Maya stared at those words, realizing that Robert wasn't just planning to steal her ranch. He was planning to kill her. Maya's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely take pictures of the documents with her phone. She needed this evidence, but she also needed to put everything back exactly as she had found it. Robert couldn't know that she had discovered his plan. As she carefully returned the files to the briefcase, Maya found one more document that made her blood run cold. It was a forged power of attorney agreement with her signature already filled. All Robert needed was an opportunity to file this document with the county courthouse, and he would have legal control over her ranch. Maya closed the briefcase and made sure the lock was properly secured. Then she hurried back to the house, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. Robert wasn't just a con artist, he was a murderer who had killed at least 3 other ranch owners in similar schemes. She immediately called the police station, but the same officer she had spoken with before was skeptical. "Those could be fake documents," he pointed out. "How do we know this man didn't create those files to make himself look more impressive?" "Call the police departments in the areas where those other ranches are located," Maya urged. "Check if there really were suspicious deaths or property transfers involving someone named Thomas Mitchell." "We'll look into it," the officer promised. "But you need to be very careful about making accusations without solid proof. If these men are innocent, you could be charged with harassment or defamation." Maya hung up the phone, feeling frustrated and terrified. Even with photographic evidence of Robert's criminal files, law enforcement was reluctant to take action. She was running out of time and options. That afternoon, Maya decided to search the rest of the ranch for additional evidence. In the old storage shed that Robert had told her to avoid, she found equipment that confirmed her worst fears. There were tools for breaking into safes, devices for copying keys, and chemicals that she recognized from crime shows as being used to drug people. Hidden behind some old farm equipment, Maya discovered a plastic tarp and several bags of lime, materials commonly used to dispose of badas. The realization that Robert had been preparing to murder her and hide the evidence made Maya feel sick to her stomach. She also found a laptop computer that Robert had been using for his criminal activities. When she opened it, Maya discovered email communications with other criminals, discussing potential targets and sharing information about successful property frauds. One email thread revealed that Robert's real name was Thomas Brennan, and that he had been operating this scam for over 10 years. David and Daniel weren't just his sons, they were his trained accomplices, who had been helping him since they were teenagers. The emails also showed that the Coleman family had been watching Maya for months before they approached her. They had researched her background, her financial situation, and her lack of ranch experience. She had been selected as a target because she fit their preferred victim profile: isolated, inexperienced, and emotionally vulnerable. Maya printed out the most incriminating emails and added them to her collection of evidence. She now had proof of Robert's criminal identity, his involvement in multiple property frauds, and his plan to kill her. But she still needed to figure out how to use this evidence to protect herself. When Robert returned that evening, Maya forced herself to act normally. She asked about his trip to the livestock auction and listened to his explanation about potential cattle purchases. All the while, Her skin crawled with the knowledge that she was having dinner with a man who was planning to murder her. "I've been thinking about that power of attorney agreement we discussed," Robert said casually. "It would really simplify things if I could handle some of the legal paperwork for the ranch transactions." Maya's heart pounded, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I'm still not sure about that. It's a big step to give someone else legal authority over my property." "Of course," Robert replied smoothly. "But consider the practical benefits. I could handle all the complicated paperwork while you focus on learning the hands-on aspects of ranch management." Maya nodded and smiled, buying herself more time while she figured out her next move. She excused herself early that evening, claiming she was tired and wanted to get some rest. In her bedroom, Maya used her laptop to research the other ranch cases that Robert had documented. She found newspaper articles confirming that the deaths and property transfers had actually occurred, exactly as described in Robert's files. She also discovered that law enforcement in those areas had suspected foul play but had never been able to prove criminal involvement. In each case, Thomas Mitchell had appeared as a helpful ranch manager who had tried to save failing properties, but the owners had died or disappeared before investigations could be completed. Maya realized that she was probably the only person who had ever found concrete evidence of Robert's crimes. She had a responsibility to stop him, not just for her own safety, but to prevent him from victimizing other innocent ranch owners. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of Robert and his sons moving around outside, Maya finalized her plan. She couldn't rely on law enforcement to protect her. She would have to expose Robert's crimes publicly in a way that would force authorities to take action. The annual county ranchers' meeting was scheduled for the following weekend. Every ranch owner in the area would be there, along with local law enforcement and county officials. If Maya could present her evidence at that meeting, Robert wouldn't be able to escape or cover up his crimes. She just had to survive until then, and hope that Robert didn't decide to accelerate his timeline. Maya clutched her phone, which contained all the photographic evidence she had gathered, and tried to get some sleep. In less than a week, she would either expose a dangerous criminal or become his next victim. Maya's planned to wait until the ranchers' meeting began to unravel on Thursday morning when she overheard a phone conversation that chilled her to the bone. She was returning from feeding the chickens when she heard Robert's voice coming from the barn, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "We need to move faster than planned," Robert was saying. "I think she's getting suspicious. Yesterday I caught her looking through some papers in the office, and she's been asking too many questions about our previous jobs." Maya pressed herself against the barn wall, straining to hear more. "No, we can't wait until next month," Robert continued. "If she starts digging deeper into our background, this whole operation could fall apart. We need to get the power of attorney signed this weekend and complete the transfer by Monday." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "I don't care if it seems rushed," Robert replied irritably. "We've already invested too much time in this property to lose it now. The girl is becoming a liability, and we need to deal with her before she becomes a bigger problem." Maya's blood turned to ice as she realized what "deal with her" meant. Robert was planning to kill her within the next few days, not weeks or months as she had hoped. She had run out of time. She quietly crept away from the barn and returned to the house, her mind racing. The ranchers' meeting was still 3 days away. She couldn't wait that long to expose Robert's crimes. She needed to get help immediately. Maya decided to drive to town and go directly to the sheriff's office with all her evidence. Surely the combination of Robert's criminal files, the fake identification cards, and the emails proving his involvement in multiple murders would be enough. To convince law enforcement to take action, she told Robert that she needed to run errands in town and would be back by afternoon. He seemed more watchful than usual, and Maya noticed that David and Daniel exchanged a meaningful look when she announced her plans. "Maybe one of us should go with you," David suggested. "We could help you carry whatever you need to pick up." "That's not necessary," Maya replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm just picking up some supplies and running a few quick errands." "We don't mind," Daniel insisted. "It's always good to have help with heavy items." Maya realized that they were trying to prevent her from going to town alone. They must have sensed her growing suspicion and were moving to restrict her movements. "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to handle these errands myself," she said. Firmly. Robert studied her face carefully. "Is everything all right, Maya? You seem a bit tense lately." "I'm fine," Maya replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired from all the changes around here. Sometimes I need a little time alone to clear my head." Course," Robert said, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Just be sure to drive carefully. The weather forecast calls for storms this afternoon." Maya nodded and headed for her truck, acutely aware that all three men were watching her every move. As she drove down the driveway, she checked her rear view mirror and was alarmed to see David climbing into another vehicle. Sure enough, as Maya drove toward town, she noticed David's truck following at a distance. He was being careful not to get too close, but he was definitely tracking her movements. Maya's heart pounded as she realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She drove to the sheriff's office, hoping that David wouldn't follow her directly there. When she parked in front of the building, she saw David's truck pull into a gas station across the street. He was watching and waiting to see what she would do. Maya walked into the sheriff's office with her phone containing all the photographic evidence. She asked to speak with the sheriff immediately, explaining that she had uncovered evidence of multiple murders and was in immediate danger. The desk sergeant looked skeptical. "The sheriff is in a meeting right now. Can this wait an hour or two?" "No, it can't wait," Maya said urgently. "The people who are planning to kill me are watching this building right now. If I leave without getting help, I might not get another chance." The sergeant finally agreed to interrupt the sheriff's meeting. Sheriff Williams was a middle-aged man with a kind but tired expression. He listened patiently as Maya explained her situation and showed him the photographs on her phone. "This is certainly concerning," the sheriff said after reviewing the evidence. "But I have to ask, how do we know these documents are authentic? Anyone can create fake files on a computer." Maya felt like screaming with frustration. "Call the police departments in those other counties," she pleaded. "Verify that those deaths really happened. Check if Thomas Mitchell was really involved in those property transfers." "We'll definitely investigate," Sheriff Williams promised, "but that kind of research takes time. In the meantime, is there somewhere safe you can stay while we look into this?" "They're watching me right now," Maya said desperately. "If I don't go back to the ranch, they'll know I've reported them. And if I do go back, they might decide to kill me tonight instead of waiting until the weekend." The sheriff walked to the window and saw David's truck parked across the street. "Tell you what," he said thoughtfully. "I'll have one of my deputies follow you back to the ranch and keep an eye on things. If these men really are dangerous, we'll have someone nearby to respond quickly." It wasn't the immediate arrest Maya had hoped for, but it was better than nothing. She agreed to the plan and prepared to return to the ranch, knowing that her life might depend on convincing Robert that her trip to town had been innocent. The drive back to the ranch was the longest 20 minutes of Maya's life. David followed behind her as usual, and she could see the sheriff's deputy following at an even greater distance. She had to convince Robert that everything was normal while hoping that help would arrive in time if things went wrong. When Maya arrived at the ranch, Robert was waiting for her on the front porch. His expression was more serious than she had ever seen it. "How were your errands?" he asked, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. "Fine," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just picked up some supplies and checked on a few things in town. Did you speak with anyone interesting?" Robert pressed. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. "The usual people at the feed store and the bank. Nothing important." Robert nodded. Slowly, but Maya could tell he wasn't convinced. "We need to talk," he said finally. "There are some important decisions that need to be made about the ranch's future." Maya followed Robert into the house, acutely aware that David and Daniel were positioning themselves to block the exits. She glanced out the window and was relieved to see the sheriff's deputy's vehicle parked at the end of the driveway. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the power of attorney," Robert began. Given the complexity of the cattle purchases we discussed, I really think we should finalize that arrangement tomorrow. Tomorrow seems awfully fast, Maya said carefully. Sometimes in business you have to move quickly to secure the best opportunities, Robert replied. His friendly mask was starting to slip, and Maya could see the calculating criminal underneath. I'd like to have my lawyer review any legal documents before I sign them, Maya said. Robert's expression hardened. That could take weeks. By then, the investment opportunities will be gone. I understand that, but this is my grandfather's ranch. I have a responsibility to be careful with such important decisions. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. David and Daniel moved closer, and Maya realized that the confrontation she had been dreading was about to begin. Maya, Robert said quietly, I think you know why we're really here. Maya's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you are, Robert replied. The question now is what we're going to do. About it, outside, Maya could hear a vehicle approaching. She prayed it was the sheriff's deputy coming to check on the situation. Robert heard it too, and his eyes flashed with anger and alarm. It seems you've been busier in town than you admitted, he said coldly. Maya knew there was no point in pretending anymore. I know who you really are, Thomas Brennan. I know about the other ranches, and I know what you're planning to do to me. Robert smiled, but it was the coldest, most frightening expression Maya had ever seen. In that case, we have a problem that needs to be solved immediately. The sound of car doors slamming outside told Maya that help had arrived, but she wasn't sure. If it would be enough to save her from the dangerous men who had been living on her ranch for the past month. The sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch made Robert's face turn pale. He had been counting on having more time before law enforcement became involved. David and Daniel moved toward the windows, looking for escape routes, but Maya could see that the property was surrounded. Sheriff's Department. A voice called from outside. We need to speak with everyone in the house. Robert's mask of friendly helpfulness completely disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a cornered criminal. This complicates things, he said quietly, pulling a knife from his pocket. But it doesn't change the basic problem we need to solve. Maya backed toward the kitchen, her heart pounding. You can't hurt me with the sheriff's deputies right outside. You'd be surprised what can happen in a few minutes, Robert replied grimly. Car accidents, falls downstairs, all sorts of tragic mishaps that can occur before help arrives. Before Robert could move toward Maya, the front door burst open. Sheriff Williams entered with 2 deputies, their weapons drawn. Everyone stay exactly where you are. The sheriff commanded. Robert was too experienced to resist when he was clearly outnumbered. He dropped the knife and raised his hands, but his eyes remained fixed on Maya with pure hatred. David and Daniel followed their father's lead, though Maya could see them calculating whether they could make a run for it. Maya, are you hurt? Sheriff Williams asked, keeping his weapon trained on Robert. I'm okay, Maya replied, though her voice was shaking. But you need to search the barn and the storage shed. There's evidence of other crimes hidden around the property. While one deputy handcuffed Robert and his sons, Sheriff Williams accompanied Maya to show him where she had found the incriminating evidence. The briefcase full of files on other ranch victims was exactly where Maya had left it, and Robert's laptop contained even more damaging information than she had initially discovered. This is enough evidence to connect these men to at least 5 different property frauds across 3 states, Sheriff Williams said grimly as he reviewed the files. And it looks like 3 of those cases involved suspicious deaths. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Robert's criminal operation. His real name was indeed Thomas Brennan, and he had been running property fraud schemes for over 15 years. David and Daniel were his biological sons, but they had been raised from childhood to help execute his crimes. The family had developed a sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable targets, usually people who had recently inherited rural properties and lacked experience in agricultural management. They would research their victims thoroughly, then approach with offers of help that seemed too good to refuse once they gained the victim's trust. They would gradually isolate them from outside contacts and make them dependent on the criminals. Expertise. The final step was always the same: convince the victim to sign over power of attorney, transfer the property to accounts controlled by Thomas, then eliminate the original owner to prevent any future legal challenges. Maya learned that. She had been incredibly lucky. The other ranch owners who had fallen victim to Thomas's scheme had not discovered his true identity in time to save themselves. Her grandfather's habit of keeping detailed records and her own suspicious nature had saved her life. The trial took place 8 months later. Maya testified about her experiences, and law enforcement from multiple states presented evidence linking Thomas and his sons to a string of property frauds and murders spanning more than a decade. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but the documented files in Thomas's possession made their guilt undeniable. Thomas Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of murder and fraud. David and Daniel, who had cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, were each sentenced to 20 years in prison. The judge noted that while they had been manipulated by their father from a young age, they were adults who had participated in serious crimes. The resolution of the case brought Maya a sense of justice, but it also left her with the enormous challenge of rebuilding her ranch operation. Everything that Thomas had implemented needed to be evaluated and often completely redesigned. Some of his improvements had been genuine and helpful, but others had been designed to make Maya dependent. On his expertise, Maya hired a legitimate ranch management consultant recommended by the County Agricultural Extension Office. Helen Rodriguez was the experienced ranch manager who had worked with several family operations in the area. Unlike Thomas, Helen focused on teaching Maya to manage the ranch herself rather than taking control of the operations. "The goal is to make you independent, not dependent," Helen explained during their first meeting. "I want to work myself out of a job by giving you all the knowledge and skills you need to run this place successfully on your own." Under Helen's guidance, Maya learned the real fundamentals of ranch management. She discovered that many of the techniques Thomas had claimed were industry standards were actually unnecessarily complicated methods designed to make him seem indispensable. The actual work of running a cattle ranch was challenging, but straightforward once she understood the basic principles. Maya also hired 2 local ranch hands, Jake Martinez and his teenage son Lays, who helped with the daily physical work while Maya continued learning. Unlike Thomas's sons, Jake and Lise were genuinely interested in helping Maya succeed. They lived in town and came to work normal hours, giving Maya the peace of mind that came with controlling her own property. The financial recovery took longer than the operational recovery. Thomas had spent thousands of dollars on unnecessary equipment and supplies, claiming they were essential investments. Maya had to sell some of the cattle to pay off debts that Thomas had encouraged her to take on, but she gradually rebuilt the ranch's profitability on a more solid foundation. A year after Thomas's arrest, Maya attended the annual county ranchers' meeting where she had originally planned to expose his crimes. This time, she was there as a successful ranch owner rather than a desperate victim. Several of the older ranchers who had known her grandfather complimented her on the improvements she had made to the property. "Your grandfather would be proud," said Bill Thompson, who owned the ranch 15 miles away. "It takes real courage to rebuild after what you've been through." Maya had also become an advocate for helping other inheritance ranch owners avoid similar crimes. She worked with law enforcement to develop educational materials about property fraud schemes, and she spoke at workshops for new ranch owners about the warning signs of criminal targeting. "Trust your instincts," Maya would tell audiences. "If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And never give anyone control over your property until you've thoroughly verified their background and references." The experience had changed Maya in fundamental ways. She was more cautious about trusting strangers, but she was also more confident in her own abilities. She had learned that she was stronger and more resourceful than she had ever imagined. 2 years after inheriting the ranch, Maya stood on her front porch one morning, drinking coffee and watching her cattle graze peacefully in the pasture. The mountains in the distance were still beautiful, but now the silence felt peaceful rather than isolating. She had built a network of relationships with neighboring ranchers, local suppliers, and community organizations. The ranch was generating steady profits, and Maya had paid off all the debts that Thomas had encouraged her to accumulate. More importantly, she understood every aspect of the operation and felt confident, making independent decisions about the property's future. Maya often thought about her grandfather and how proud he would be to see his ranch thriving under her management. She had not only saved the family property, but had also helped protect other ranch owners from falling victim to similar crimes. As she finished her coffee and prepared to start another day of work, Maya reflected on how much her life had changed. The scared, overwhelmed woman who had inherited this ranch was gone, replaced by someone who had faced down dangerous criminals and emerged stronger than before. The experience had taught her that sometimes the help you think you need isn't the help you actually need. Maya had been looking for someone to solve her problems, but what she had really needed was the confidence to solve them herself. Her grandfather's ranch was safe, and Maya had finally become the rancher she was meant to be.